South Korea's foreign minister said today that Trump's order to cut joint drills appears to be pressuring Seoul to back U.S. efforts in the Iran war. That turns a routine exercise adjustment into a transaction across two theaters, linking Korea's deterrent to a Gulf conflict 3,000 miles away. And that is not the whole day. Moscow faces its largest drone wave. An Israeli strike in Syria nearly drew in Turkey, and Trump shut the door on Iran talks. The through line starts in Seoul. Why would the United States ask South Korea to end its biggest annual defensive exercise 6 days early? That is the question driving every alliance desk in East Asia tonight, because the Ulchi Freedom Shield drill is now scheduled to wrap on August 21 instead of running its full course. And Seoul's Joint Chiefs say the change came at Washington's explicit request. The order follows President Donald Trump's instruction to the Pentagon to scale back U.S. and South Korean exercises, a move the White House frames as a way to preserve what Trump calls his good relationship with Kim Jong-un and to reopen a diplomatic path. South Korean President Lee Jae-myung has long argued for a stronger homegrown defense, yet the announcement has left parts of Seoul visibly uneasy. The reason surfaced within hours. South Korea's foreign minister said publicly that the cut appears designed to pressure Seoul into supporting U.S. efforts in the Iran war, alongside demands for more investment. A reading Al Monitor reports from a South Korean minister as well. What exactly changed in the last 24 hours? The exercise itself is not cancelled, but its length and scope are being reduced. That means fewer combined command posts, fewer live-fire rotations, and less integration between American and Korean units at the exact moment. North Korea has accelerated missile tests and deepened its military partnership with Russia. Since the June 2024 Comprehensive Strategic Partnership Pact, Pyongyang has supplied Moscow with troops, artillery ammunition, and ballistic missiles for use in Ukraine, so a thinner US and Korean rehearsal does not happen in a vacuum. The diplomat warns the cut risks turning alliance readiness itself into a bargaining chip, and that is the core risk. A deterrent posture built over decades becomes leverage in unrelated negotiations. The follow-on effects are already visible across several markets and alliances. Defense stocks and procurement timelines in Seoul are likely to shift, because Lee's government has every incentive to accelerate indigenous capabilities if it suspects the U.S. commitment is conditional. Currency and credit markets will watch the Won and South Korean defense paper, while Japan and Australia will recalculate what a transactional U.S. approach means for their own deterrence. North Korea, Russia, and China all read the cut as a sign the alliance is negotiable, which is why Kim Yo-jong can say her brother retains good memories of Trump while the North keeps expanding its nuclear and missile programs. What the move signals on doctrine is a shift from automatic extended deterrence to conditional burden sharing. Trump is treating the drills not as a sunk cost of alliance maintenance, but as a chip he can move on a larger board, linking Korea to Hormuz and investment demands in the same conversation. The trajectory forks in two directions. One path sees Seoul accelerate its own military buildup and accept a smaller U.S. footprint, turning South Korea into a more independent but more exposed power. The other path sees Trump and Kim return to summit diplomacy, but with Pyongyang testing more missiles to maximize leverage before any handshake. What is still unverified? The precise scope of the cut has not been released in full. No official U.S. document has tied the order explicitly to Iran war support or investment demands. That connection comes from the South Korean foreign minister's reading of the pressure. North Korea has not yet issued a formal response, and it is unclear whether the reduction applies only to Ulchi Freedom Shield or will extend to future exercises. What to watch next? Any North Korean missile launch in the next 72 hours, South Korea's defense budget supplemental, and whether Washington issues a joint statement clarifying the cuts or lets the ambiguity stand. And while Seoul recalibrates its deterrent, 600 drones were already inbound on Moscow. Ukraine launched more than 600 long-range drones at the Russian capital overnight, according to Moscow's mayor, who called it one of the largest long-range assaults on the Moscow region in more than 4 years of fighting. CBS News reports the assault ranked among the largest of the war. The Moscow Times reports one person lost their life in the wave. The strikes hit or threatened multiple sites, including a major logistics center outside the city, a Wildberries warehouse, and the Bashneft UNPZ oil refinery in Bashkortostan, where Militarny's geospatial analysis places the fire at the key AVT-6 unit. A confirmed strike on the Wildberries logistics hub would also squeeze consumer supply chains, widening the economic pressure beyond fuel and military logistics. Russian air defenses were active across the region, and the scale alone is the story. A mass-produced, long-range unmanned campaign is now reaching the capital with regularity. What changed from yesterday is not just the number, but the admission. President Vladimir Putin, speaking after the wave, acknowledged that Kyiv's deep strikes are causing us harm, while denying they have produced critical consequences. That rare public concession tells us more than any damage photograph, because it confirms the cumulative pressure on Russian air defense, logistics, and oil infrastructure is becoming impossible to dismiss. Russia also warned the United Kingdom it will pay a price for supplying attack drones to Ukraine, a threat that elevates a bilateral exchange into a confrontation on NATO's edge. The warning follows a pattern of Russian officials naming Western suppliers as legitimate targets when their own air defense struggles to stop the incoming waves. The follow-on effects run through energy, shipping, and insurance markets. Every refinery fire and logistics blaze tightens the margin on Russian fuel supplies to the front, which can force Moscow to choose between rationing military fuel and drawing down strategic reserves. The strikes also keep Black Sea and overland insurance premiums elevated because the same drone technology that reaches Moscow can reach ports, pipelines, and grain corridors. For global markets, the risk is not a single facility but a pattern. If Ukraine can mass enough drones to overwhelm Moscow's layered defenses, then no Russian rear area target is automatically safe. What the campaign signals is a doctrinal shift in how Kyiv fights a larger opponent. Instead of matching Russia shell for shell at the front, Ukraine is using cheap, scalable unmanned systems to impose its cost deep inside Russia, betting that economic and political pressure will compound faster than battlefield breakthroughs. The clearest sign that the strategy is working is Putin's own statement. The clearest sign that it is dangerous is Russia's warning to London, which suggests Moscow is looking for external actors to blame as its air defense narrative phrase. The trajectory splits in two. One path sees Russia escalate missile and loitering munition strikes on Ukrainian cities and the energy grid, using mass retaliation to restore deterrence. The other path sees both sides reach a deep strike parity that makes a winter pause more attractive than mutual attrition, especially if Western pressure grows. The distinguishing marker will be whether Russia's next wave targets civilian infrastructure indiscriminately or concentrates on military and energy nodes. What remains unverified? The Russian Ministry of Defense's claim about how many drones were intercepted has not been independently confirmed, and the exact damage to the Bashneft unit and the Moscow Logistics Center is still being assessed. The degree of UK involvement in supplying the specific drones used in this wave is also unconfirmed, though Russia's warning frames it as direct support. What to watch next? Russia's retaliation target set within 48 hours, any British government response to the warning, and whether Ukraine can sustain this launch rate without exhausting its stockpile. And while Moscow counted the cost, the day's most dangerous single strike landed in Syria. Israel hit the Abu al-Duhur airbase near Idlib, and the immediate U.S. reaction was not support but alarm. U.S. envoy Tom Barak told the Jerusalem Post, the strike could have scrambled Turkish jets and led to a rapid escalation into direct military confrontation, possibly including Turkey. France 24 reports the United States condemned the strike and blamed its ally, while Israel accused Turkey of preparing to send troops to the same base, casting the hit as preemptive self-defense. Haaretz carried the same warning. The operation risked a direct clash between Israel and Turkey. Where this happened matters as much as what happened. Abu al-Duhur sits in northwest Syria, in the zone where the new post-Assad government, Turkish influence, and Israeli red lines all overlap. The base lies on the edge of Idlib province, an area Turkey has used as a buffer against both Kurdish forces and any Syrian government it does not trust, so an Israeli strike there carries alliance implications beyond the target itself. Israel has struck Syrian weapons transfers and infrastructure for years. Hitting a base that Ankara may be preparing to use is a different category of risk, because Turkey is a NATO member and maintains forces and proxies across Idlib and northern Syria. A direct exchange between Israeli and Turkish aircraft or troops would open a second front in a region already stretched by Gaza, Lebanon, and the Red Sea. The follow-on effects start with NATO. A confrontation between Israel and Turkey would force the alliance into an impossible position, since Turkey can invoke Article 4 consultations and possibly Article 5 if Turkish territory is struck, while Israel is not a NATO member but is a major US partner. For NATO, the nightmare is not a formal Article 5 request, but the political fracture that would follow if a member state and a major US partner traded fire, while the alliance tries to stay focused on Russia. Washington's public discomfort, delivered through Barack, suggests the US effort to support Syria's new government and manage Turkey is colliding with Israel's unilateral operational tempo. The result is friction inside the relationship between Washington and Israel at a moment when both need coordination against Iran. What the strike signals is that Israel will act against any Turkish footprint it interprets as a threat, regardless of US preferences. That is a significant escalation ladder rung, because it moves the conflict from Israeli strikes on Iranian or Syrian assets to Israeli strikes on an actor on NATO's edge. The unverified claim that Turkey was preparing to deploy troops to Abu al-Duhur comes from the Israeli side, and the Turkish government has not confirmed any such deployment. If the claim is overstated, the strike becomes even more provocative. The trajectory forks in two. One path sees Turkey retaliate directly or through Syrian proxies, turning northwest Syria into a live theater pitting Israel against Turkey. The other path sees Washington impose a quiet freeze on Israeli operations near Turkish positions, using diplomatic leverage to prevent a clash that could fracture the coalition against Iran. The distinguishing marker will be whether Israel strikes another Turkish-linked site in the next week, or whether US and Turkish officials begin visible coordination on Syrian base status, the exact Israeli force package used in the strike, any casualties on the ground, and whether Turkey had actually decided to deploy troops to the base. The US condemnation language reported by France 24 has not been matched by an official State Department release in the bundle, so the exact American position should be treated as reported rather than confirmed. What to watch next? Turkish military movements near Idlib, any Israeli follow-up strikes, and whether the US envoy's warning produces a public Israeli pause or a doubling down. And while Israel and Turkey stare each other down, the wider Gulf standoff just hardened. The United Arab Emirates has cut trade ties with Iran, according to multiple reports, doing so within hours of a call between President Donald Trump and UAE leadership. The UAE has historically been one of Iran's main Gulf trading partners, so a cut carries real weight rather than symbolic value. Iran responded by warning Gulf states against helping the United States, and Trump posted on Truth Social that there are no talks or conversations going on or scheduled with the Islamic Republic of Iran. The pressure campaign around Hormuz remains a live fact, and the strait is the choke point where energy, diplomacy, and military pressure intersect. What changed from yesterday is the public collapse of any diplomatic window. A day ago, analysts were watching for signs of an Oman-mediated understanding that might reopen Hormuz in exchange for sanctions relief. Today, Trump closed that door from his own account, and the UAE's trade cut suggests a Gulf state is aligning itself with the US pressure campaign at real economic cost. Al Monitor reports Tehran is now explicitly threatening Gulf capitals that assist Washington, which turns the conflict from a dispute between Washington and Tehran into a regional coercion campaign against America's own partners. The follow-on effects are immediate. Any sustained closure or restriction of Hormuz traffic raises oil and LNG shipping insurance premiums, lengthens routes around Africa, and puts upward pressure on European and Asian energy prices. For Europe and Asia, every day the strait is restricted adds cents to the per-liter price and forces utilities to draw down gas storage faster than planned. The UAE's move also signals to Iran that even its historical trading partners are willing to absorb losses to avoid being seen as aiding the US effort. which may harden Tehran's negotiating position or accelerate its own retaliatory options. Defense stocks and Gulf defense procurement will move on every statement out of Tehran and Washington. What the standoff signals is that both sides are now bargaining through public posture rather than back channels. Trump denies talks because he believes pressure works. Iran warns the Gulf because it wants to raise the cost of that pressure for Washington's allies. The performance is aimed as much at domestic audiences as at foreign capitals. Trump wants to look unbending, and Tehran wants to look able to isolate its enemies, even under pressure. The clearest sign of which side is winning the coercion battle will be whether more Gulf states follow the UAE or whether Oman and Qatar keep their channels to Tehran open. One path sees Gulf states fold further to Iran's threats and quietly resume trade or refuse deeper U.S. basing, leaving the U.S. with fewer regional partners and a wider blockade burden. The other path sees the U.S. escalate with more naval forces and strikes on Iranian export infrastructure, forcing Tehran to choose between economic collapse and concessions. The distinguishing marker will be whether the UAE reverses its trade cut or doubles down with public statements. The exact commodities and volume covered by the UAE trade cut have not been detailed, and the precise U.S. role in the decision is unclear, with Times of India noting the American part is undefined. Iran's claim that the U.S. is seeking an exit from the region, reported by Al Jazeera, is a partisan read and should be treated as unverified. What to watch next? An official UAE statement, any ship traffic data through Hormuz, Iranian missile or drone tests, and whether Washington sends additional carrier or drone assets to the Gulf. In the next 24 hours, watch 4 concrete markers that will decide which trajectory takes hold. First, whether North Korea fires a missile or stages a border incident to test the reduced US and South Korea exercise posture. Second, whether Russia's retaliation for the Moscow drone wave targets civilian infrastructure indiscriminately or stays on military and energy nodes, because that choice reveals Moscow's escalation logic. Third, whether Israel conducts another strike near Turkish-linked positions in Syria after the US. Envoy's warning, or whether Washington succeeds in pressing a pause. Fourth, whether the UAE issues an official statement confirming the scope of its Iran trade cut and whether Oman or Qatar follow or resist. If you found this briefing useful, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tap the bell so you do not miss the daily update. We will be back tomorrow with the next worldwide conflict brief. See you tomorrow.